Today I would like you to learn or review 16 adjectives frequently used in legal English, together with their opposites. A company becomes insolvent if it doesn't have sufficient funds to pay its liabilities on an ongoing basis. Sufficient means enough. The opposite of solvent is insolvent. The opposite of sufficient is insufficient. Assets may be transferable, or in other words, alienable. It means that you can transfer or alienate them, or, put simply, sell them or give them to somebody else. The opposite of transferable is non-transferable. The opposite of alienable is inalienable. Sometimes in order to transfer something, you may need permission of another person, for example a co-owner. If this is the case, you may see in legal texts the phrase that something shall not be done without express consent of somebody. Express consent is consent clearly given, not implied. The opposite of express is implied. If a rule or a piece of legislation applies to a specific situation, that is, it is relevant and should be used, we say that it is applicable. The opposite of applicable is inapplicable. As a consequence, if the person to whom the rule or a piece of legislation applies fails to follow that rule or comply with that piece of legislation, somebody else, for example, a competent authority, may enforce that rule or piece of legislation, that is, make that person comply with it. If it's possible, such a rule or piece of legislation is enforceable. Compliance with it can be enforced, somebody can be forced to comply with it. The opposite of enforceable is unenforceable. A power of attorney or an offer may be revocable. It means that you can withdraw it, cancel it. The opposite of revocable is irrevocable. A revocable power of attorney may concern representing somebody for the purpose of selling a real property, for example a house. A real property may also be referred to as an immovable property, or simply an immovable. Immovable is the opposite of movable. The sale of the house may be conditional, that is, it will occur only if a certain condition is satisfied. The opposite of conditional is unconditional. Selling and buying something requires an exchange of consideration, that is, something of value. In our example, the seller provides non-monetary consideration, namely the house, while the buyer provides monetary consideration, that is, he or she pays the price. The opposite of monetary is non-monetary. Let's switch to another example. Evidence in court may be admissible. If it is admissible, it means that it satisfies all the requirements and can be accepted. The opposite of admissible is inadmissible. While on the subject of court proceedings, why does one person sue another person? The reason is that there must be a contentious issue between them. They cannot agree on something, cannot reach a consensus, there is a dispute between them. If something is contentious, it means that it involves a dispute or is related to a dispute. The opposite of contentious is uncontentious. If you make an assumption, you accept something as true and you don't question it. A more legal term for an assumption is a presumption. Presumptions may be made, but they may be also rebutted, that is, negated. A presumption that can be rebutted is called a rebuttable presumption. The opposite of rebuttable is irrebuttable. By the way, instead of saying rebut, rebuttable and irrebuttable, you can say refute, refutable and irrefutable. Last but not least, one of the most frequently used adjectives in legal English is reasonable. You can talk, for example, about reasonable steps, reasonable expectations, reasonable doubt, reasonable self-defense, reasonable person, reasonable cause. If something is reasonable, it makes sense, is not too far-fetched, is fair or moderate, and if somebody is reasonable, he or she has common sense, does not behave in an irrational way. The opposite of reasonable is unreasonable. Let's have a quick recap. What is the opposite of solvent? Insolvent. What is the opposite of sufficient? Insufficient. What is the opposite of transferable? Non-transferable. What is the opposite of alienable? Inalienable. What is the opposite of express? Implied. What is the opposite of applicable? Inapplicable. What is the opposite of enforceable? Unenforceable. What is the opposite of revocable? Irrevocable. What is the opposite of movable? Immovable. What is the opposite of conditional? Unconditional. What is the opposite of monetary? Non-monetary. What is the opposite of admissible? Inadmissible. What is the opposite of contentious? Uncontentious. What is the opposite of rebuttable? Irrebuttable. What is the opposite of refutable? Irrefutable. What is the opposite of reasonable? Unreasonable. Thank you for your attention.